At exactly 11:42 on the frozen morning of December 20th, 1943, the sky above Bremen, Germany, ceased to be just a battlefield and became a high-altitude graveyard. Staff Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode was crouched inside the tail gunner's compartment of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. He was isolated in the freezing slipstream, watching the world through a pane of bulletproof glass at 27,300 feet. Up here, the environment is as hostile as deep space. The air is so thin that a human being will lose consciousness in 30 seconds without a pressurized oxygen mask. But the real enemy on this morning was the cold. The outside air temperature had plunged to a bone-crushing 60 degrees below 0 Celsius. At this temperature, exposed skin freezes instantly to metal, sweat turns to ice inside flight suits, and machine gun oil thickens into a useless sludge. Inside the fuselage of the bomber, identified by tail number 423167 and affectionately nicknamed Ye Olde Pub, the situation had escalated from dangerous to catastrophic in the span of 10 minutes. This aircraft, a 36,000-pound behemoth of aluminum and steel, was no longer a functioning aerodynamic machine. It was, for all intents and purposes, a falling piece of debris that was stubbornly refusing to obey the laws of gravity. To truly understand why this aircraft was about to become a tomb for 10 young American airmen, we must peel back the aluminum skin and analyze the engineering that failed them, and the brutal physics that was trying to kill them. The machine itself was a B-17F model, the pride of American aviation engineering. It was designed to be a flying fortress, a weapon capable of delivering death from the stratosphere while defending itself against the best fighters in the world. It was powered by 4 Wright R-1820-97 Cyclone radial engines. Each of these engines was a masterpiece of mechanical complexity, a 9-cylinder radial beast capable of generating 1,200 horsepower at takeoff. These engines were fed by General Electric turbo superchargers that compressed the thin air of high altitude, allowing the bomber to operate where other planes would stall and fall. Defensively, the aircraft bristled with 11 Browning .50 caliber machine guns. Each gun could spew 800 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition per minute. The bullets left the muzzle at 2,900 feet per second, creating a kinetic energy impact capable of shredding engine blocks. The theory of American air power was based on the concept of the combat box, a tight, three-dimensional formation of bombers where the fields of fire overlapped, creating an impenetrable wall of lead that theoretically no enemy fighter could survive. But on this particular morning, the theory had collapsed under the weight of reality. The mission had begun at dawn with high hopes. The target was the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, a critical industrial heart of the Nazi war machine. Ye Olde Pub was assigned to a position known as the Purple Heart Corner. This was the grim nickname given to the outermost position of the low squadron, the most vulnerable spot in the formation. Exposed, unprotected, it was the first target for any attacking fighter and the last to receive cover fire from the group. The bombing run itself was successful. The payload was dropped on the factory coordinates. But at 11:32, the anti-aircraft defenses of Bremen, the dreaded 88mm flak cannons, found their mark. It wasn't a barrage. It was a sniper shot with an artillery shell. A single 88mm flak shell exploded directly in front of the aircraft's nose. The results were forensic in their violence. The plexiglass nose cone wasn't just cracked or shattered. It was completely vaporized. In a fraction of a second, the aerodynamic profile of the plane was destroyed. At 150 miles per hour, the slipstream blasted into the fuselage like a hurricane. The wind chill factor inside the cockpit dropped the temperature to 60 below zero instantly. The bombardier and the navigator were subjected to immediate thermal shock. their electrically heated suits being the only thin barrier standing between them and immediate hypothermia. Their maps, charts, and instruments were torn from their desks and swirled around the cabin like a snow globe of debris. But the flak had done more than just open the cabin to the freezing sky. High-velocity shrapnel had severed the oil lines to the number 2 engine. On the pilot's instrument panel, the oil pressure gauge for engine number 2 dropped dead to zero. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, the 21-year-old pilot from West Virginia, reacted with the instincts trained into him. He immediately hit the feathering button. The huge 3-bladed propeller twisted, turning its edges into the wind to reduce drag, and the engine shuddered to a halt. Ye Olde Pub was now a 3-engine aircraft. In a heavy bomber loaded with fuel and equipment, losing 25% of your power at high altitude is a death sentence for formation flying. The plane could no longer maintain the airspeed required to stay in the protective combat box. It began to drift back. It began to lose altitude. It became a straggler. And in the unforgiving skies over Germany, a straggler is nothing more than prey. And then the sharks arrived. Jagdgeschwader 11, one of the Luftwaffe's most elite fighter wings, was patrolling the sector. Their ground controllers had spotted the lone bomber limping away from the protection of the group. It was the perfect target. 15 German fighters, a deadly mix of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, peeled off to intercept. These were not rookie pilots. These were veterans who knew exactly how to dismantle a B-17. They knew that attacking from the rear was dangerous because of the tail gunner, so they executed a textbook head-on attack. They climbed high, positioning themselves at 12 o'clock high, and then dove. They dove at the bomber at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. With the bomber flying towards them at 150, the closing speed was over 600 miles per hour. This gave the German pilots less than 2 seconds to aim and fire, but they didn't need long. They were armed with the terrifying 20mm Minengeschoss rounds. Unlike standard bullets that punch holes, mine shells were thin-walled casings packed with high explosives. They were designed to detonate on contact, tearing structural aluminum apart and blowing massive holes in the airframe. At 11:36, the swarm attacked. The sound was deafening, a mixture of screaming engines and the rhythmic thudding of cannon fire impacting metal. Cannon shells hammered the nose of the bomber, obliterating the oxygen system. The main supply bottles exploded, cutting off the life-sustaining gas to the crew. Without oxygen at 27,000 feet, the clock started ticking. The crew had approximately 3 minutes of useful consciousness before hypoxia would set in, a condition that begins with confusion and ends with death. They were now fighting a war on 2 fronts, the German fighters outside trying to blow them up, and the thin air inside trying to suffocate them. Simultaneously, a second wave of fighters attacked from the rear, targeting the only threat remaining, the tail gunner. Staff Sergeant Eckenrode fired his twin 50-caliber machine guns in short, desperate bursts, trying to create a defensive screen. But the physics of the engagement favored the fighters. A 20mm shell struck the tail turret directly. The explosion was contained within the small steel compartment, and the result was instantaneous and gruesome. Sergeant Eckenrode was killed instantly, decapitated by the blast. The rear of the aircraft went silent. The damage rippled through the fuselage. In the waist gunner positions, the carnage was severe. Sergeant Yoles took a piece of jagged shrapnel the size of a fist in his leg. Sergeant Pechout was hit in the eye by flying glass debris. The floor of the aircraft, usually a clean aluminum walkway, was now covered in a slick layer of frozen blood and spent shell casings. The waist gunners tried to administer first aid to each other, reaching for the morphine syrettes in their medical kits. But the extreme cold had turned the liquid morphine into solid ice. In a desperate bid to relieve the pain, they had to place the frozen needles in their own mouths, using their body heat to thaw the drug while their fingers turned black from frostbite. By 1140, the status of Ye Olde Pub was critical. The number 2 engine was dead. The number 4 engine had been hit and was running away. The governor, which controls the propeller speed, was destroyed, causing the engine to rev uncontrollably to over 3,000 RPM. The vibration was so violent it threatened to tear the entire right wing off the fuselage. Lieutenant Brown throttled it back to minimize the damage, but the engine was producing only partial power and massive drag. The hydraulic system had been bled dry, the fluid freezing instantly on the fuselage floor. This meant the landing gear could not be lowered, the flaps were inoperative, and the brakes would not work even if they managed to land. The rudder cables were shredded, leaving only a few strands of wire connecting the pilot to the tail control. With 1 crew member dead, 4 critically wounded, and all suffering from hypoxia, the aircraft was losing altitude at 500 feet per minute. From an engineering standpoint, the lift-to-drag ratio was now negative. The aircraft was not flying, it was falling with style. Lieutenant Brown was fighting the control yoke with every ounce of physical strength he possessed. His left leg was numb from pressing on the rudder pedal to counteract the asymmetrical thrust of the dying engines. He was alone. He was 250 miles from the nearest friendly runway. He had no escort. He had no defense. And then, just when it seemed it couldn't get any worse, a final threat appeared on his visual field. A single Messerschmitt 109 settled in behind the shattered tail. It wasn't attacking, it was stalking. The pilot was Franz Stigler, an ace with 27 confirmed kills, a man who needed just one more victory to secure the Knight's Cross. He closed the distance to 200 yards. He aligned his glowing Rivet gun sight on the fuselage of the bomber. He had the kill shot lined up. The physics of survival had finally run out. The execution was about to begin. To understand the absolute inevitability of the execution that was about to take place at 27,000 feet, we must first analyze the executioner. While Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown was wrestling with a broken machine in the frozen stratosphere, the threat was mobilizing on the ground with terrifying precision. The pilot who had just slotted onto the tail of the crippled bomber was Oberleutnant Franz Stigler. He was not a conscript forced into the cockpit by the desperation of war. He was a veteran, a man who had aviation in his blood long before the first shots of World War II were fired. Franz Stigler was 28 years old, which in the brutal life expectancy of a Luftwaffe fighter pilot made him an ancient survivor. He had begun flying gliders at the age of 12 and had flown commercial routes for Lufthansa before the war, navigating across Europe by the stars. By December of 1943, he was an established ace. His logbook recorded 27 confirmed aerial victories. In the ruthless mathematics of the Luftwaffe scoring system, every kill brought a pilot closer to the ultimate prize, the Knight's Cross. Stigler was sitting on 27 kills. He needed just one more to reach the threshold. Just one more heavy bomber to secure the highest military honor in Germany. Statistically, he was one of the deadliest men in the European theater, a hunter who knew exactly how to dismantle an aircraft piece by piece. But Franz Stigler was a complex anomaly within the Nazi war machine. Beneath the leather flight jacket and the Iron Cross, he carried a ghost in his cockpit. His older brother, August Stigler, had been a pilot as well, but August was a vocal anti-Nazi who had died early in the war in a crash that haunted France. Before he died, August had instilled a deep, unshakable sense of morality in his younger brother, warning him never to lose his humanity to the party's ideology. France was a devout Catholic in a regime that often despised religion, wearing a rosary beads inside his flight suit. But there was another voice that echoed in Stigler's head even louder than his brother's. It was the voice of his mentor, Gustav Rödel. Years earlier, when Stigler was serving in North Africa with Jagdschwader 27, Rödel, who was then the Jesuiter Commodore, had gathered his young pilots for a briefing that would define Stigler's entire life. Rödel looked them in the eye and said, "Honor is everything here." He told them that they were fighter pilots, not butchers. He issued a standing order that violated the ruthlessness of the German command. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." Rödel taught Stigler a fundamental distinction. You fight the machine, not the man. You destroy the wings and the engines, but you do not murder the pilot who has already lost the fight. This was the psychological conflict raging inside the cockpit. A man trained by the state to kill, but taught by his mentor to respect life. But philosophy does not shoot down bombers, engineering does. The weapon Stigler strapped himself into on that freezing morning was the Messerschmitt Bf-109 G6 model. Allied pilots called it the Gustav. If the B-17 was a flying fortress designed to take punishment, the 109 was a scalpel designed to inflict it. It was small, agile, and dangerously overpowered. At the heart of this beast sat the Daimler-Benz DB605A engine. This was a liquid-cooled, inverted V12 engineering marvel that utilized direct fuel injection, a technology far ahead of the carbureted engines used by the Americans and British early in the war. This injection system allowed the engine to operate under negative G forces without cutting out, meaning Stigler could dive, roll, and loop without his engine sputtering, keeping constant pressure on his target. The engine produced a staggering 1,475 metric horsepower. It could drag the lightweight airframe to a top speed of 398 miles per hour at high altitude. That is nearly 150 miles per hour faster than Charlie Brown's crippled B-17. But speed was just the delivery system. The true horror lay in the payload. Stigler's aircraft was armed with a nose-mounted Mk-108 30mm cannon. This weapon was nicknamed the pneumatic hammer by German pilots because of its distinctive, heavy-pounding firing sound. It fired the same high-explosive Minengeschoss rounds that had already decimated Ye Olde Pub's nose cone. Technical analysis from the Luftwaffe proving grounds showed that it took an average of 25 hits with a standard 20mm round to bring down a heavy bomber. But with the 30mm Mk-108, the math changed terrifyingly. It took only 4 hits, 4 shells to sever a wing spar, 4 shells to detonate a fuel tank, 4 shells to turn a fuselage into a fireball. Franz Stigler was sitting on a belt of 60 of these shells. He had enough firepower at his fingertips to destroy Ye Olde Pub 15 times over. The intercept itself began at 11:38. Stigler was on the ground at an airfield near Jever, standing on the wing of his aircraft, supervising a ground crew as they refueled and rearmed his fighter. He had just returned from a mission and was frustrated, having shot down 2 bombers earlier only to have them unconfirmed because they fell into the sea. Suddenly, the air around the airfield began to vibrate. He heard a sound that every German pilot knew by heart, the low, throbbing, uneven rumble of Wright's Cyclone engines in distress. Stigler looked up. Through a gap in the overcast clouds, he saw the silhouette of a B-17. It wasn't flying in a formation, it was alone. It was trailing a thick plume of black smoke, and it was flying dangerously low and slow. Stigler realized instantly that this was a straggler, a wounded animal separated from the herd. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't wait for the radar controller to vector him in. He tossed his cigarette to the ground and scrambled into the cockpit. The ground crew barely had time to yank the fuel hoses away before he hit the starter. The Daimler-Benz engine roared to life, spitting blue flame and black smoke from the exhaust stacks as the cylinders caught fire. He taxied to the runway and slammed the throttle forward to emergency power. The torque of the massive engine was so immense it tried to pull the small fighter off the runway to the left, forcing Stigler to stomp on the right rudder pedal to keep it straight. He lifted the tail, rotated, and clawed his way into the gray sky. The climb performance of the G6 was phenomenal, 4,000 feet per minute. It took him less than 6 minutes to reach the bomber's altitude. He approached from the rear and below, sitting in the blind spot, perfectly executing the standard doctrine of the hunter. Approach unseen, strike hard, vanish. As he closed the distance, his eyes scanned the sky for the bomber's little friends. The American P-47 Thunderbolts or P-51 Mustangs that usually escorted the heavy bombers. But the sky was empty. The straggler was utterly alone. Stigler checked his weapons panel. The guns were armed, the safety was off, and the Rivi gun sight was illuminated. He adjusted his trim for a high-speed cruise and closed to within 1,000 yards. Through the optical glass of the Rivi 16B gun sight, the bomber grew larger, filling his field of view. He could see the damage now in high definition. He saw the shredded rudder flapping uselessly in the slipstream. He saw the gaping hole where the left horizontal stabilizer used to be. He saw the black oil streaking down the fuselage from the dead No. 2 engine. And most critically, he saw the tail gunner's turret. Usually this was the most dangerous part of the approach. The twin .50 calibers would be tracking him, spitting fire. But the guns were pointing straight up at a dead angle. The glass was shattered. Stigler realized with a jolt that the gunner was dead. He eased back on the throttle to avoid overshooting. He matched the bomber's speed, sliding in closer. 500 yards, 200 yards. He was now flying tight formation with the enemy. He was so close he could see the individual rivets on the aluminum skin. He could see the jagged holes where the 20mm rounds from the previous attack had punched through. He could see the blood frozen on the fuselage. His finger rested on the trigger button on the control stick. One squeeze. Just 1 second of fire. That was all it would take to send the 10 men inside spiraling down to their deaths. That was all it would take to win the Knight's Cross. The mathematical equation was complete. Target acquired, target defenseless, solution clear. But as Stigler looked through the torn skin of the bomber, he saw something that broke the equation. He saw a man in the waist gunner position. The man was wounded, struggling to stand, covered in blood. And he was looking right back at Stigler. He didn't raise his gun. He didn't try to fire. He just stared. In that fraction of a second, Franz Stigler stopped being a predator. He remembered the voice of Gustav Rödel. You fight the machine, not the man. This B-17 was no longer a machine of war. It was a parachute made of metal, and the men inside were falling. The predator was about to make a choice that would change history. At exactly 12:05 p.m., the physics of aerial combat dictated that the B-17 bomber, ye Olde Pub, had reached its expiration date. Franz Stigler was positioned perfectly at the 6 o'clock position, the classic hunter's blind spot where the target is most vulnerable. His airspeed was hovering near 300 miles per hour, while the battered bomber ahead of him was limping along at barely 140. The closing speed was 160 miles per hour. At this rate of closure, a collision was imminent within seconds. Stigler had to act with the split-second precision of a surgeon. He chopped his throttle back to idle and aggressively deployed his combat flaps to increase drag. The sleek Messerschmitt shuddered violently as it fought against its own aerodynamics to shed velocity, dropping from an attack speed to a near-stall crawl. He was now floating just 50 feet behind the tail of the American bomber, a distance so close that the smell of burning oil and cordite from the B-17 was being sucked into his own cockpit intake. Through the optical glass of his Rivi 16B gun sight, the image that presented itself was horrifyingly clear. Usually, a fighter pilot sees an enemy aircraft as a silhouette, a geometric shape, or a target to be destroyed from a safe distance of 400 yards. But from 50 feet away, Stigler wasn't looking at a target. He was looking at an autopsy. The magnification of the sight revealed the anatomy of the destruction in gruesome detail. He saw the rudder hanging by a single twisted hinge, swaying drunkenly in the slipstream like a broken limb. He saw the gaping hole in the fuselage, jagged and raw, large enough for a man to fall through without touching the sides. He saw the internal ribs of the airframe exposed to the freezing air like the bleached bones of a skeleton. And then he saw the blood. Frozen red streaks ran from the shattered tail gunner's turret all the way down the horizontal stabilizer, painting a gruesome stripe across the white American star. Stigler knew instantly that the tail gunner was dead. No human being could survive that kind of kinetic impact. He shifted his gaze to the waist gun positions and saw the barrels pointing uselessly at the sky, unmanned. He realized with a jolt that the crew inside was decimated. This was not a combatant anymore. It was a flying ambulance carrying dying men. This was the moment of the moral singularity. In the German Luftwaffe, the code of conduct was absolute. Shoot down the enemy, destroy the machine, win the war. To let an enemy escape was a court-martial offense punishable by imprisonment. To assist an enemy was treason, and the penalty was death by firing squad. On the other hand, dangling right in front of him was the Knight's Cross. Stigler knew with mathematical certainty that if he pulled the trigger now, the bomber would explode. It would be effortless. He wouldn't even have to aim, he just had to squeeze his hand. He would land, report the kill, and by evening he would be a national hero with the highest medal in the Third Reich around his neck. The medal was literally one trigger pull away. But inside the cockpit, another voice was screaming louder than the Daimler-Benz engine. It was the voice of his commanding officer, Gustav Rödel. Stigler remembered the words clearly spoken years ago in the heat of the North African desert. Honor is everything here. If I see you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. Stigler looked at the B-17. It had no defenses. It could not maneuver. It was bleeding altitude. In his mind, this aircraft was no longer a plane. It was a parachute made of aluminum and steel. And the men inside were helpless. To shoot them now would not be a victory. It would be murder. Stigler made his choice. He took his gloved finger off the trigger. He removed his hand from the firing stick entirely, breaking the circuit of violence. He pushed the throttle forward, and the engine roared in protest as he pulled the nose up and banked right. The Messerschmitt surged forward, climbing up the left side of the bomber to get a look at the pilot. Inside the cockpit of Ye Olde Pub, Lieutenant Charlie Brown was fighting a losing battle to keep the plane in the air. He was exhausted, freezing, and terrified. Suddenly, a shadow fell over his window, blocking out the sun. He turned his head to the left and his heart stopped. Flying wingtip to wingtip less than 20 feet away was a German fighter. Brown could see the black cross on the gray fuselage. He could see the rivets. He could see the pilot's face, framed by a leather helmet and goggles. Brown froze on the controls. He waited for the muzzle flash. He waited for the cannon shells to tear through the glass and end his life. But the German pilot was not shooting. He was looking at him. And then, impossible as it seemed, the German pilot nodded. In the waist of the bomber, the surviving gunner saw the fighter too. Despite his wounds and the shock, his training took over. He grabbed the barrel of the .50 caliber machine gun and tried to swing it around to bear on the enemy. He wanted to fire, to take one last shot at the Nazi who was mocking them. But his hands were numb with frostbite and the gun mount was damaged from the flak. Stigler saw this movement. He saw the American gunner struggling to aim at him. Stigler did not flinch. He did not peel off or take evasive action. He simply looked at the gunner and shook his head slightly. It was a clear message. Don't do it. I am not going to kill you. Don't make me change my mind. The American gunner, defeated by the cold and the situation, let go of the weapon and collapsed back onto the frozen floor. The tension in the air was absolute. Two enemies flying side by side in a broken formation, violating every rule of warfare. Stigler turned his attention back to Charlie Brown. He began to make frantic hand signals. He pointed down with his gloved index finger. He pointed toward the ground below them. He was trying to say, "Land in Germany. Surrender. You will survive the war." Charlie Brown shook his head violently. No, he was not going to surrender. He would rather die in the air than spend the war in a prison camp. Stigler tried again. He pointed to the east, toward Sweden. Sweden was a neutral country only 30 minutes away by air. If they flew to Sweden, they would be interned, but they would get medical attention, food, and they would live. But Charlie Brown did not understand. He was disoriented, hypoxic, and terrified. All he knew was that England was to the west. He shook his head again and stubbornly pointed the nose of the bomber toward the North Sea, toward England. Stigler looked at him with disbelief. To fly to England meant crossing the Atlantic Wall, the most heavily defended coastline in history. Hundreds of German flak guns were waiting there, trained to shoot down anything that moved. In this condition, the B-17 would be shredded in seconds. Stigler realized that this brave, foolish American was trying to fly a dead plane through a wall of fire. Stigler checked his fuel gauge. He was running dangerously low. He had to make a decision right now: leave them to die or do the unthinkable. He decided to become their shield. He stayed locked on the left wing of the bomber, positioning his fighter between the B-17 and the ground batteries. As they approached the coastline, the German anti-aircraft batteries on the ground spotted the formation. The flak gunners tracked the targets through their optical sights. They saw the massive, smoking B-17, a perfect, slow-moving target. They prepared to fire. But then they saw the silhouette of the Messerschmitt 109 flying in tight formation with the bomber. The German gunners hesitated. They held their fire. They couldn't shoot. If they fired at the bomber, they risked hitting one of their own aces. They assumed that the fighter had captured the bomber and was escorting it to a nearby airfield for surrender. Stigler knew exactly what he was doing. He was using his own aircraft and his own identity as a German officer to jam the guns of his own army. For 10 agonizing minutes they flew over the coast. Every gun on the ground tracked them, barrels moving in sync with the planes. Not a single shot was fired. They cleared the coast. They were over the open water. The Atlantic Wall was behind them. Franz Stigler had just smuggled the enemy through the front door. Now over the gray waters of the North Sea, the moment of departure had arrived. Stigler looked at Charlie Brown one last time. He raised his hand. He didn't wave. He brought his hand to his forehead in a crisp, formal military salute. It was a gesture of supreme respect, from one warrior to another. Then he banked his fighter hard to the left. He rolled away and dove back toward Germany. Charlie Brown watched him go. He was alive. His crew was alive, and he had absolutely no idea why. The mathematical impossibility had just happened. But now, Stigler had to land, and he had to keep a secret that could get him killed. At 12:15 p.m., over the churning, gray waters of the North Sea, the impossible escort mission came to an abrupt and silent end. Franz Stigler banked his Messerschmitt hard to the left, leveling his wings for a split second to snap a final, crisp salute before diving away toward the European mainland. Inside the shattered cockpit of Ye Olde Pub, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown watched his guardian angel disappear into the mist. But as the silhouette of the German fighter vanished, the adrenaline faded, and the brutal reality of physics returned with a vengeance. The B-17 was no longer under the protection of a Luftwaffe ace. It was once again a dying wreck flying on 1.5 engines. The structural integrity of the fuselage was critical. The tail section was swaying visibly in the wind, held together by nothing more than a few twisted metal spars and the stubborn will of the airframe. If Brown made a single violent control input, or if they hit a pocket of severe turbulence, the entire tail section would snap off, sending the bomber tumbling uncontrollably into the freezing waves below. They were still 250 miles from the English coast. The altitude was dropping steadily. 3,000 feet. 2,500 feet. The fuel situation was the next nightmare. The gauges were bouncing on the empty mark, flickering between life and death. The navigator, Second Lieutenant Al-Sadok, did the mental math and the result was terrifying. At their current rate of fuel consumption and drag, they would run dry 20 miles short of the coast. This meant ditching in the North Sea in December. The water temperature was close to freezing. Survival time in the water was measured in minutes, not hours. With 4 critically wounded men on board who could barely walk, let alone swim, ditching wasn't a landing. It was a death sentence. Brown gave the order to lighten the load. It was a desperate garage sale at 2,000 feet. Everything that wasn't bolted down was thrown overboard to shave off precious pounds. Heavy machine guns were ripped from their mounts and tossed into the sea. Ammunition belts, flak jackets, radio equipment, and even the Norden bomb sight, a piece of equipment so secret that crews were sworn to protect it with their lives, were jettisoned into the waves. The aircraft groaned and vibrated, but it kept flying. For 2 agonizing hours, they limped across the water. The drone of the single functioning engine was the only sound, and every member of the crew was listening for the sputter that would signal the end. But the sputter never came. At 1400 hours, the coastline of England finally appeared through the fog. It was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen, a smudge of green against the gray. They were too low on fuel to reach their home base at Kimbleton. They needed a runway, any runway, immediately. Brown spotted an airfield ahead. It was RAF Seething, home of the 448th Bomb Group. He didn't have radio contact to ask for permission. He didn't have time to circle. He lined up on the runway and committed to the landing. He ordered the crew to manually crank down the landing gear because the electrical system was dead. The wheels locked into place with a reassuring thud, but the danger wasn't over. They had no hydraulic fluid. That meant they had no flaps to slow the plane down, and more importantly, they had no brakes to stop it. The bomber came in hot, hitting the tarmac at 130 miles per hour, far faster than a standard landing. Smoke screeched from the tires as they made contact. Brown fought the rudder pedals, dancing on the controls to keep the heavy beast straight. The huge bomber rolled down the runway, bleeding off speed inch by agonizing inch, until it finally coasted to a stop at the very edge of the grass. The propellers spun down. A heavy silence fell over the airfield. Then, the chaos began. The ground crews of the 448th came running out to the plane, expecting to pull bodies from a crash. They stopped dead in their tracks when they got close. They had seen damaged bombers before. They had seen planes come back with engines out, but they had never seen a flying skeleton. One mechanic later told the press, "I have no idea what kept that tail on the airplane." The fuselage was shredded. The nose was gone. The internal structure was exposed to the daylight. They counted the bullet holes. There weren't dozens, there were hundreds. It was a miracle of aerodynamics that defied explanation. But the biggest shock was waiting in the debriefing room. Charlie Brown and his surviving crew were rushed to the intelligence officers. A major sat down with Brown, opened a file, and asked the standard question, "Lieutenant, report, how did you survive?" Charlie Brown was exhausted, frozen, and in shock, but he told the absolute truth. He said, "Sir, we were shot up. We were dead in the air. A German fighter came up." The major stopped writing and looked up sharply. "And he attacked you?" "No, sir," Brown replied. "He escorted us. He flew wingtip to wingtip. He jammed the flak guns for us, and then he saluted and let us go." The room went completely silent. The intelligence officers looked at each other in disbelief. This story was impossible. The Germans were monsters. They were the enemy. They didn't show mercy. The major stood up abruptly and left the room to make a phone call to the high command of the 8th Air Force. An hour later, he returned with a grim expression. He looked at Charlie Brown and delivered a crushing blow. "Lieutenant," he said, "what you are about to hear is a direct order. You are not to tell anyone about this. You will not speak of this to the press. You will not write about it in letters home. You will not discuss it with other pilots in the mess hall. Brown was stunned. "But sir, he saved our lives. He deserves to be known. This proves they aren't all bad." The major slammed the file shut. "Lieutenant, we are in a total war. If we tell our pilots that there are good Germans out there, they might hesitate to shoot. Hesitation gets men killed. This incident is classified top secret. As far as the world is concerned, it never happened." The report was buried in a vault. Charlie Brown's crew was sworn to secrecy. The miracle was erased from history. Meanwhile, 400 miles away, across the English Channel, another silence was being kept. Franz Stigler landed his Messerschmitt at his base near Bremen. His mechanic ran up to the plane as the propeller stopped turning. "Herr Oberleutnant," he shouted. "Did you get him? Did you get the bomber?" Stigler climbed out of the cockpit, his legs shaking from the adrenaline. He looked at his empty gun barrels. He needed that kill. He needed it for the Knight's Cross. He looked at his mechanic, and he looked at the other pilots walking toward him. Told them the truth, that he had let a B-17 escape, that he had escorted the enemy to safety. The Gestapo would be there within the hour. Treason in the Third Reich was not punished with a jail cell, it was punished by a firing squad. So Stigler made a choice that would weigh on his soul for decades. He looked his mechanic in the eye and lied, or rather, he omitted the truth. He said, "The bomber went down over the sea, no claim." He never filed the combat report. He never claimed the victory. He sacrificed the highest honor of his country to save the lives of 10 men he didn't know. For the rest of the war, Stigler flew hundreds of missions. He flew the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter. He survived the collapse of Germany, but he never spoke a word about the B-17. Charlie Brown went back to war. He flew 25 more missions over Europe. He survived the war, went to college, and lived a full life. But in the back of his mind, for 40 years, a question haunted him. Who was that pilot? Why did he save me? Was he still alive, or did he die in the flames of Berlin? The two men lived their lives on opposite sides of the ocean, separated by thousands of miles and the silence of a war that had ended long ago. But they were bound together by a secret that neither of them could forget. The silence lasted for 4 decades. Until 1986, when an old Charlie Brown finally decided to break the order. For 40 years, the incident over the skies of Bremen remained a secret buried deep within the classified archives of the United States Air Force and hidden in the private memories of 2 men living on opposite sides of the world. The war ended. The world moved on. Cities were rebuilt, borders were redrawn, and former enemies became allies. Charlie Brown returned to civilian life, eventually settling in Miami, Florida, where he became a successful businessman and raised a family. Thousands of miles away, Franz Stigler, the German ace who had spared him, moved to Canada in 1953. He started a new life in Vancouver, working as a logger and later in business, trying to leave the ghosts of the Luftwaffe behind him. They lived on the same continent, separated by 3,000 miles of land and the deafening silence of a war that had ended decades ago. But for Charlie Brown, the memory of that day in December 1943 refused to fade. It haunted him in the quiet moments. He would often look up at the sky and wonder about the man who had looked him in the eye and chosen not to kill him. Who was he? Why did he do it? Was he punished for his mercy? Or did he die in the flames of Berlin like so many others? In 1986, at a reunion of combat pilots, Charlie Brown finally decided to break the silence. He stood up and told the story of the German fighter pilot who had escorted him to safety. The room was stunned, but without a name, it was just a story. Determined to find the answer, Brown began a relentless 4-year search. He scoured the archives of the Luftwaffe and the 8th Air Force, but he hit dead end after dead end. Finally, in an act of desperation, he placed an advertisement in a newsletter for German fighter pilots called Jägerblatt. The ad was simple and poignant. "I am searching for the German pilot who escorted a crippled B-17 out of Germany on December 20, 1943. He included his home phone number and waited. January 1990. Charlie Brown was sitting in his home in Florida when the phone rang. He picked it up, expecting a telemarketer or a friend. Instead, he heard a voice with a heavy German accent on the other end. The voice was shaking slightly. "Hello, Captain Brown," the man asked. "I am the one." Charlie Brown stopped breathing. The world seemed to stop spinning. The voice continued, "I have wondered about you for 40 years. Did you make it home?" The man on the phone was Franz Stigler. He was living in Vancouver, Canada. He had seen the ad in the newsletter and recognized the date and the details immediately. He told Brown, "I didn't shoot you because, for me, it would have been like shooting a man in a parachute." The two old enemies talked for hours, bridging a gap of 4 decades in a single afternoon. But a phone call was not enough. They needed to see each other. They needed to look into each other's eyes one more time, not through gun sights and bulletproof glass, but as free men. On June 21, 1990, the meeting was arranged in a hotel lobby in Seattle, Washington. A television crew was there to document the moment, but the emotion in the room transcended any camera lens. Charlie Brown, now 68 years old, stood waiting, his hands trembling. Across the room, Franz Stigler, 75 years old, walked in. There were no salutes this time. There were no uniforms, just two old men, survivors of the deadliest conflict in human history, finding peace at last. They walked toward each other and embraced. They hugged and cried like children, holding onto each other as if to make sure the other was real. In that moment, the war was finally, truly over. Later that day, Franz Stigler said something to Charlie Brown that would become the defining statement of their friendship. He said, "Charlie, I didn't kill you because you were defenseless. To me, you were not an enemy. You were like my brother." To understand the magnitude of this moment, we must look at the cold, hard statistics of the air war. During World War II, the U.S. 8th Air Force lost 26,000 men, more than the entire U.S. Marine Corps lost in the Pacific Theater. The average life expectancy of a B-17 crewman was just 11 missions. The survival rate for a lone straggler over German territory was statistically 0. By all the laws of probability and warfare, Charlie Brown should have died on December 20th, 1943. By all the laws of military discipline, Franz Stigler should have shot him down. But they defied the numbers. They defied the hatred. In a war defined by industrial-scale slaughter, they chose to be human. In the years that followed their reunion, Charlie and Franz became inseparable best friends. They traveled together across North America, they went fishing, and they visited schools and air shows to tell their story. They called each other brother until the very end. In a poetic twist of fate, they died just months apart in 2008. Franz Stigler, the ace who refused to kill, passed away in March. Charlie Brown, the pilot who refused to fall, followed him in November. It was as if they were wingmen, waiting for each other to make the final flight together. So, what is the ultimate lesson of Protocol 1943? In war, soldiers are trained to follow orders without question. They are taught that the enemy is a faceless target to be destroyed. But at 27,000 feet, amidst the blood, the freezing cold, and the terror, one man chose to listen to his conscience instead of his commander. He proved that even in the darkest hour of humanity, a spark of decency can survive. The B-17, ye Olde Pub, was scrapped long ago. The Messerschmitt is gone, but the legacy of that single salute will fly forever. This was the story of the bomber that refused to die and the enemy who became a brother.